rope felt rough against her neck. April 25th, 1848. Celia stood on the wooden platform, her hands bound behind her back, and looked out at the small gathering of men who had come to watch her die. She was 31 years old. In the 16 years she had served the Fairchild family, she had prepared over 17,000 meals. The last thing she ever cooked was death itself. But this story doesn't begin with an execution. It begins with a whisper. Baton Rouge, Louisiana. December 1849. A poorhouse on the eastern edge of the city, where the forgotten came to die. In a narrow bed pushed against a water-stained wall, an elderly woman lay dying. Her name was Ruth. She had been a seamstress once, decades ago, on a plantation that no longer existed. The fever had taken her slowly, burning through her body for 3 weeks, until her skin stretched thin over her bones like parchment. The priest leaned close to hear her final confession. What he heard made his hands tremble so violently that he dropped his Bible. Ruth's voice was barely a whisper, but her words were clear. She told him about her daughter. She told him about cherry pits and oleander flowers. She told him about 17 deaths that the authorities had called fever, but that had been something else entirely. Something deliberate. Something that had erased one of Louisiana's most powerful families from existence. The priest tried to stop her, begged her to be silent. But Ruth kept talking, and when she finally stopped, when her chest rose one last time and didn't fall again, the priest sat in that dim room for an hour, trying to decide what to do with the terrible knowledge she had given him. He never reported what he'd heard. Some truths, he decided, were too dangerous to speak aloud. But the story didn't die with Ruth. It survived in whispers and fragments, in sealed documents and hidden journals, in the gaps between official records and actual events. And now, over a century and a half later, we can finally tell you what really happened in St. Martin Parish between the spring of 1847 and the spring of 1848. We can tell you about the woman who learned to make death taste like sweetness. We can tell you about the dynasty that vanished and the price of power when the powerless decide they've had enough. Before you hear this story, do something for me. If you're drawn to the darkest corners of American history, to the stories that were deliberately buried because they revealed too much truth, hit that subscribe button right now. Turn on notifications, because the Sealed Room specializes in the narratives that someone wanted forgotten, the ones that matter most. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I want to know where this story travels. Now, let me take you back to Louisiana in 1847, to a world of wealth built on suffering, to a family that thought themselves untouchable, to a woman who proved them wrong. The Fairchild Empire stretched across 12,000 acres of Louisiana soil. 3 plantations, 3 branches of the same family tree. 400 human beings who were owned like furniture, worked like animals, and discarded when they were no longer profitable. The Fairchilds called this civilization. They called it order. They called it the natural way of things. They were about to learn how quickly the natural order can collapse when someone decides to rewrite the rules. Thomas Fairchild controlled the main estate. 43 years old, cold as January rain. He kept ledgers that recorded every penny spent, every bushel of sugar produced, every human being purchased. He prided himself on his precision. His grandfather had been a Revolutionary War colonel, had bled for this country, had earned this land through service and sacrifice. Thomas believed he had inherited not just property, but a kind of sacred duty to maintain what his grandfather had built. What he had actually inherited was an empire built on theft. But that's not how he saw it. 15 miles south, his brother William ran a smaller operation near New Iberia. Where Thomas was cold calculation, William was hot rage. He settled disputes with his fists. He kept a whip within arm's reach at all times. He made examples of people who displeased him, and he slept soundly at night because he believed fear was the most effective management tool ever invented. The third branch belonged to their cousin, Margaret Fairchild Rousseau. Her plantation lay north, closer to Breaux Bridge. Margaret was something unusual for the time, a woman running a major agricultural operation herself after her husband's death. She did it with ruthless efficiency. Where Thomas kept emotional distance and William wielded violence, Margaret used mathematics. She calculated the minimum food necessary to keep workers alive. She determined the optimal balance between punishment and productivity. She reduced human beings to numbers in her account books, and she thought this made her rational. Enlightened even, all three estates relied on the labor of enslaved people. 400 souls whose names appeared in ledgers next to livestock, whose families could be torn apart with a signature, whose children were born into bondage because someone had decided, centuries ago, that skin color determined whether you were a person or property. Among those 400 was a woman named Celia. She was born on the original Fairchild plantation around 1817, though no one bothered to record the exact date. Her mother was Ruth, the same Ruth who would die in a Baton Rouge poorhouse 32 years later, still carrying her daughter's secrets. Ruth taught Celia to read in secret, using torn pages from discarded books and scraps of newspaper. Teaching enslaved people to read was illegal. Knowledge was dangerous. Knowledge made people harder to control. Ruth knew this. She did it anyway. When Celia turned 14, Elizabeth Fairchild, Thomas's wife, a Baltimore native with northern sensibilities but southern moral blindness, noticed the girl's intelligence. She brought Celia into the main house to train as a cook. It was presented as an opportunity, a chance to work indoors, to develop a skill, to serve the family more directly. What it actually was a cage with better wallpaper, but Celia learned. God, did she learn. Over the next 16 years, she became the finest cook in St. Martin Parish. She mastered French techniques for sauces and reductions. She learned to preserve vegetables for winter, to cure meats, to create pastries so delicate they practically dissolved on the tongue. Guests at Fairchild dinner parties praised her cooking effusively. Other plantation families tried to borrow her services. Margaret Rousseau offered to purchase Celia outright on 3 separate occasions. Thomas always refused. Some assets were too valuable to sell. Celia had access to the main house, to private conversations, to family secrets. She heard Thomas discuss selling Sarah, her childhood friend, to a Mississippi plantation, separating the young woman from her children without a moment's hesitation. Business, nothing more. She overheard William boast about punishing a man named Joseph for the crime of learning to write. She watched Margaret calculate profit margins while families were torn apart to balance ledgers, and she had access to something else. The still room. It was a small building behind the main house where medicines were prepared. Herbs hung from the rafters, drying in the Louisiana heat. Elizabeth Fairchild kept an extensive collection there. Laudanum for pain, calomel for purging, ipecac for vomiting, digitalis extracted from foxglove for heart conditions, and dozens of other substances, both healing and harmful, that 19th century households considered necessary for maintaining health. Elizabeth thought she knew what these substances did. She fancied herself educated in home remedies, but Celia knew more, much more. She had spent years studying these materials, learning their properties not from medical texts, which she wasn't allowed to read openly, but from careful observation. From knowledge passed down from older enslaved people who remembered African practices. From her mother, who had taught her which wild plants could cure fever and which could cause it. Celia understood dosages, timing, the crucial importance of consistency. She knew that suspicion would fall on her immediately if anything obvious happened. So she watched and she waited and she learned, storing knowledge like a weapon she hoped she'd never need to use. And then came May of 1847, the moment when hope died, and something darker took its place. His name was Samuel. He was 12 years old. His mother, Anna, worked in the Fairchild laundry. 3 years earlier, Samuel had been sold away. Anna had not seen her son since. She had searched for him in every way an enslaved woman could search, asking travelers, listening to gossip, praying to a God who seemed to have stopped listening, and then, by the cruel mathematics of the slave trade, Samuel came back. A trader passing through New Iberia had him. Thomas Fairchild purchased the boy, not out of mercy, not because Anna had begged him, had offered to work additional hours, to do anything required. Thomas bought Samuel because he needed another field hand and the price was fair. For 3 weeks, Anna thought her prayers had been answered. She was allowed to see Samuel each evening, to feed him, to hold him, to tell him she had never stopped searching, to believe for the first time in 3 years that maybe God was listening after all. Then William Fairchild visited his brother's estate and decided he wanted Samuel for his own operation. The boy was strong for his age, William observed. Would be useful for the harder labor required on his less mechanized plantation. Thomas agreed to the sale immediately. Business, nothing more. Anna's screams could be heard across the entire plantation. She collapsed in the yard, clawing at the dirt, begging them to kill her instead. Thomas ordered her locked in the slave quarters until she regained her composure, which he expected would take a day or two at most. Celia helped carry Anna to the quarters. She sat with her through the night, listened to her weep, listened to her call Samuel's name over and over until her voice broke, listened to the silence that followed, which was somehow worse than the screaming. Just before dawn, Anna looked at Celia with eyes that held nothing but emptiness. 5 words. There is no God here. 2 days later, Anna was dead. Heart failure brought on by excessive distress, according to the plantation physician who diagnosed her without examining the body closely, who stood in the doorway of the cramped, stifling quarters because he wouldn't step inside where enslaved people lived. Celia prepared Anna's body for burial, washed her, wrapped her in clean cloth, and as she worked, she made a decision. She would not run. Running meant abandoning her own daughter, Mary. Running meant dogs and hunters and almost certain death. Running meant living in fear forever, even if you somehow succeeded. Instead, she would stay. She would cook, and she would begin adding something extra to the Fairchild family meals. Something that would work slowly enough to avoid suspicion. Something that would seem like natural illness. Something that would let her move between the 3 estates as she had always done, her presence so ordinary that no one would think to question it. She would give them sweetness and death in equal measure. And she would watch them wonder why God had abandoned them. The first symptoms appeared on May 23, 1847, 3 weeks after Anna's burial. Elizabeth Fairchild complained of tremors in her hands during breakfast. Thomas attributed the tremors to nerves. Perhaps exhaustion from the previous week's dinner party, when they had hosted 12 guests from New Orleans. Celia had prepared that meal, 7 courses that drew compliments throughout the evening. The main course had been duck confit with preserved cherries, a recipe Elizabeth particularly loved, one that Celia had perfected over years of refinement. What no one at that table could have known was that the preserved cherries contained something extra, something Celia had extracted from the pits of wild cherries growing along the bayou. Her mother had shown her the process years ago, had warned her never to use it. The pits, when prepared in a specific way, produced a powder that could be added to food without detection. The substance was prussic acid, though Celia wouldn't have known it by that name. She only knew that in very small amounts, delivered consistently over time, it accumulated in the body slowly. The symptoms would seem like mysterious illness, something that progressed gradually, something that baffled physicians who looked for single causes rather than steady poisoning. The dosage was everything, too much, and the effect would be immediate, obvious, impossible to hide. But tiny amounts delivered with patience would create a pattern that looked like natural disease. Elizabeth's tremors worsened over the following week. By early June, she couldn't hold a pen steady enough to write letters. Her handwriting, once elegant and precise, became shaky and irregular. Dr. LeBlanc from New Iberia examined her and prescribed rest, along with laudanum for her nerves. A nervous condition, he suggested, perhaps brought on by the stress of managing a large household. Thomas accepted this diagnosis. He worried about his wife, but he accepted it. He instructed Celia to prepare lighter meals, broths, easily digestible foods to help Elizabeth recover her strength. Celia complied. She prepared chicken soup with herbs, beef broth with vegetables, all of it carefully made, all of it containing tiny additional ingredients that ensured Elizabeth's condition would not improve. By mid-June, Elizabeth had developed a new symptom that Dr. LeBlanc could not explain. A blackening of her tongue. It resembled the discoloration that sometimes accompanied certain fevers, but Elizabeth had no fever. Her temperature remained normal even as her tremors increased and her tongue darkened. LeBlanc consulted his medical texts, wrote letters to colleagues in New Orleans. Found no satisfactory explanation, Celia continued her work. 3 meals a day for the family. Baking bread, preserving vegetables, performing all the tasks expected of her. She maintained her usual demeanor, efficient, quiet, showing appropriate concern when asked about the mistress's health. No one suspected her because no one imagined she could be responsible. She was Celia, the cook, a fixture of the household for 16 years. As permanent and unremarkable as the furniture, What made her method particularly effective was variation. Sometimes she prepared a meal for the entire family that contained her additions. Other times she served everyone clean food, but added something extra to Elizabeth's plate specifically, disguising it in sauces or gravies where any slight bitterness would be overwhelmed by other flavors. She used the still room supplies cleverly, taking tiny amounts that wouldn't be missed, replacing them with similar-looking substances so Elizabeth's collection appeared untouched. She was meticulous, patient, invisible in the way that enslaved people had learned to be invisible, present but unnoticed. Essential but disregarded, Elizabeth Fairchild died on July 2, 1847, 40 days after her symptoms first appeared. The death certificate listed the cause as nervous fever with complications, a vague diagnosis that meant Dr. LeBlanc had no idea what had actually killed her. The funeral was well attended. Families from throughout the parish came to pay respects to Thomas Fairchild and his 2 young sons. Celia helped prepare the funeral meal, as she had helped prepare hundreds of meals before it. Baked ham with honey glaze, cornbread, green beans cooked with bacon, 3 different pies. The guests praised the food as they always did, commented that the Fairchild plantation wouldn't be the same without Elizabeth's refined tastes and Celia's expert preparation. Thomas grieved as much as a man of his temperament could grieve. He had been fond of Elizabeth in his way, though his fondness had always been secondary to his business interests. Within a month, he began discussing with his brother and cousin the possibility of remarrying. Running a plantation household required a woman's oversight, or so conventional wisdom insisted. What Thomas and William and Margaret Fairchild didn't know was that Elizabeth's death was only the beginning. Celia had started with the mistress because Elizabeth's death would seem most natural, most attributable to the vague nervous conditions that physicians blamed for numerous female ailments in that era. But her actual target was larger, more comprehensive. She intended to end the entire Fairchild dynasty, every member of the family who owned human beings, who calculated profit in terms of other people's suffering. She would do it slowly, carefully, moving between the 3 estates as she had always done. Her presence so normal that no one would ever think to connect the dots between her visits and the illnesses that followed. In August of 1847, Thomas asked Celia to help at William's plantation during a dinner party. This was a common request. Celia had cooked at William's estate dozens of times over the years. She agreed immediately, as she always did, because refusing would have invited questions. She traveled the 15 miles in a wagon driven by Daniel, an elderly enslaved man who managed transportation between the estates. The journey took most of a day along rough roads that wound through cane fields and cypress swamps. They arrived in the late afternoon. William was hosting 6 other planters and their wives, a business dinner to discuss sugar prices and shipping arrangements for the upcoming harvest. Celia prepared roasted pork with apple chutney, rice with herbs, squash cooked in butter, a molasses cake for dessert. The apple chutney was particularly well received, its sweetness balanced by a tang that the guests found refreshing in the humid Louisiana summer. What they couldn't taste, what they could never have detected, was the powder Celia had derived from oleander leaves. Oleander grew wild throughout the parish, beautiful flowers, white and pink, that people planted decoratively without understanding their toxicity. An older woman had taught Celia about oleander years ago, the same woman who had taught her about plants that looked harmless but could stop a heart or paralyze muscles when prepared correctly. The symptoms from oleander were similar to those from cherry pit poison: tremors, confusion, irregular heartbeat, eventually death. But oleander worked differently, affected different systems in the body. By varying her methods, Celia created a pattern that looked like an epidemic of mysterious fever rather than deliberate poisoning. When multiple people fell ill with similar but not identical symptoms, physicians would look for a common disease, a contaminated water source, perhaps miasma in the air. They would never imagine that someone was moving between households, carefully distributing death in precisely measured doses. On the wagon ride back to the main plantation, Daniel commented that Celia seemed quieter than usual. She told him she was tired from the long day of cooking, which was true enough. What she didn't tell him was that she was thinking about William Fairchild's face as he ate the apple chutney, how he had called for a second serving, how he had praised her skill in front of his guests. She was thinking about Anna and Mary, about the 400 souls who worked these plantations without choice or hope. She was thinking that perhaps, just perhaps, she could do something that mattered. Something that would reduce the suffering, even if only by removing 3 families from the ranks of those who caused it. She was thinking that she had become something new, something that didn't fit into the categories the Fairchilds used to organize their world. She was no longer just Celia the cook, the enslaved woman who prepared meals and kept quiet. She had become a force moving through their lives, invisible and patient, carrying death in her careful hands. The thought should have frightened her. Instead, it gave her the first sense of power she had felt in 30 years of living as someone else's property. By September of 1847, William Fairchild began experiencing symptoms identical to those that had killed his sister-in-law. The tremors started in his hands, made it difficult to write or hold objects steadily. His overseer noticed that William had trouble gripping his walking stick during field inspections, that he occasionally stumbled for no apparent reason. William consulted Dr. LeBlanc, who had treated Elizabeth during her final illness. LeBlanc was disturbed by the similarity of symptoms but could find no logical connection between the 2 cases. William hadn't been present at his brother's estate during Elizabeth's illness. There was no obvious way for him to have contracted the same mysterious fever. The doctor prescribed rest and a tonic he prepared himself, a mixture of iron supplements and herbs meant to strengthen the blood. William took the tonic faithfully 3 times a day. Noticed no improvement. The tremors worsened. His tongue began to darken. He developed difficulty sleeping, lying awake at night while his heart raced irregularly in his chest. Thomas visited his brother in October and was shocked by William's deterioration. In less than 2 months, William had lost significant weight. His face had taken on a gray pallor. His eyes had developed a wild, frightened look. Thomas insisted on bringing a second physician from New Orleans, Dr. Benjamin Cartwright, whose reputation as a diagnostician was known throughout Louisiana. Dr. Cartwright arrived in late October and spent 3 days examining William Fairchild, reviewing Dr. LeBlanc's notes, interviewing everyone in the household about William's routines and habits. Cartwright was a methodical man, educated, at the University of Pennsylvania, who approached medicine with scientific rigor unusual for the time. He noticed several things that disturbed him. First, the progression of William's illness precisely mirrored that of Elizabeth Fairchild, following the same timeline from initial tremors to tongue discoloration to cardiac irregularity. Second, there was a peculiar sweet smell in William's bedroom. Faint but detectable, something Cartwright couldn't identify. Third, when he interviewed the household staff, he learned that Celia, the cook from Thomas Fairchild's estate, had prepared a meal at William's plantation in August, shortly before William's symptoms began. Cartwright made notes of these observations in his journal but didn't draw any conclusions yet. Medical science in 1847 lacked the tools to detect poisoning except in the most obvious cases. There were no blood tests, no chemical analyses that could reveal the presence of plant toxins. Physicians relied on symptoms, on experience, on instincts. What Cartwright's instincts told him was that something was very wrong, that the pattern of illness in the Fairchild family was not natural, but instinct wasn't proof. And making an accusation without proof, especially an accusation that would implicate an enslaved woman and potentially throw suspicion on one of Louisiana's prominent families, would have been professionally and socially ruinous. So Cartwright kept his suspicions to himself, wrote carefully neutral notes in his journal, prescribed the same useless treatments that Dr. LeBlanc had tried. He told Thomas that his brother was suffering from a severe nervous disorder, possibly related to the strain of managing a plantation, possibly hereditary. He recommended rest, fresh air, and a bland diet. William Fairchild died on November 8, 1847. He was 40 years old. The death certificate listed the cause as nervous fever with cardiac complications, the same diagnosis given for Elizabeth. Dr. Cartwright attended the funeral. He observed the family carefully, noted how Thomas seemed genuinely grief-stricken, How Margaret Rousseau appeared concerned but not surprised. How the enslaved people who served the meal worked with practiced efficiency. He noticed Celia particularly. The way she moved through the house with quiet competence. The way she anticipated needs before they were expressed. He noticed that she made no eye contact with anyone. That her expression remained neutral regardless of what was happening around her. It was a demeanor common among enslaved people. A survival mechanism that made them invisible to the whites they served. But something about Celia nagged at Cartwright's medical instincts. He couldn't articulate what bothered him, couldn't point to any specific behavior that was suspicious. There was simply something in the way she existed in that space, something that suggested she was aware of things she wasn't supposed to know. After the funeral, Cartwright returned to New Orleans and added more notes to his journal. He wrote about the pattern of deaths, about the shared symptoms, about the sweet smell he had detected in William's bedroom and now faintly noticed at the funeral, in the house where the body had been prepared. He wrote about Celia, though he didn't name her, referred to her only as the cook who serves both households. Then he filed the journal away and tried to forget about the Fairchild family, because there was nothing he could do with his suspicions. Nothing that wouldn't create a scandal that could destroy his practice. In 1847, Louisiana, a physician who suggested that an enslaved woman might be systematically poisoning white families would be accused of inciting fear and rebellion, of giving dangerous ideas to people who were supposed to be kept ignorant and compliant. Cartwright's silence was the same silence that protected numerous injustices in the antebellum South. A wall of propriety and self-interest that made it easier to ignore uncomfortable truths than confront them. He told himself he had no proof, which was technically accurate, but the deeper truth was that proof would have required him to see Celia as something other than property, as a person capable of sophisticated planning and execution. And that recognition would have undermined the entire social structure he lived within. Meanwhile, Celia continued her work. With William dead, 2 of the 3 Fairchild estates were now without their primary masters. Thomas took control of William's plantation, consolidating management while he searched for a buyer. This meant Celia was called upon more frequently to cook at both locations, to prepare meals for potential buyers, to maintain the appearance of normalcy while Thomas conducted business. She moved between the 2 estates with practiced ease, carrying death in her preserves and powders, her presence so ordinary that no one thought to question it. In December of 1847, Thomas Fairchild announced his engagement to a widow from Natchez named Caroline Henricks. The wedding would take place in the spring of 1848. Thomas asked Celia to begin planning an elaborate wedding feast for 100 guests. It would be the social event of the season in St. Martin Parish. An opportunity for Thomas to demonstrate that despite his recent losses, the Fairchild name still commanded respect and resources. Celia agreed to prepare the wedding feast, accepted the assignment with the same quiet competence she brought to every task. She began making lists of ingredients, planning courses, calculating quantities. She thought about how many people would eat her food at that wedding. How many of them were planters like the Fairchilds? How many participated in the same system of human commodification? She thought about Anna and Samuel, separated forever. She thought about Mary, her daughter, who would grow up enslaved unless something fundamental changed. She thought about the 400 souls working the Fairchild plantations and the thousands more working plantations throughout Louisiana, their lives measured in bushels of sugar and bales of cotton. And she thought about prussic acid and oleander, about the ways different poisons worked in the human body, about dosages and timing and the sweet smell that apparently lingered after death, though she hadn't known about that smell until she overheard Dr. Cartwright mentioning it to Dr. LeBlanc in a conversation she wasn't supposed to hear. The wedding feast would be her masterpiece. She decided, the culmination of 16 years of perfecting her craft, of learning to combine flavors in ways that delighted and satisfied. It would also be the moment when her true purpose would become impossible to ignore, when the pattern would finally be obvious even to people determined not to see it. But first, she needed to deal with Margaret Rousseau, the 3rd branch of the Fairchild dynasty, The woman who managed her plantation with mathematical precision, who had tried 3 times to purchase Celia outright because she recognized valuable property when she saw it. Margaret had invited Celia to her estate in January to prepare a dinner for the parish council, a gathering of 12 men who controlled local government, who held significant economic power throughout St. Martin Parish. It was an opportunity Celia had been waiting for, a chance to address not just the Fairchild family, but the broader structure of power they represented. She began planning the menu for that dinner with the same care she brought to all her work, selecting recipes that would showcase her skills, that would leave the guests satisfied and impressed. She thought about proportions and timing, about which substances would work best for a large group, about how to ensure that every dish would carry exactly what she intended. And as she worked, preparing and testing recipes in the still room behind the main house, where Elizabeth Fairchild's collection of medicines and poisons remained largely untouched, Celia felt something she hadn't felt since she was a child. She felt like herself. Not Celia the cook, not Celia the slave, but Celia the person, the woman who made choices and accepted their consequences. Margaret Fairchild. Rousseau's estate, located north of Breaux Bridge along Bayou Teche, represented the third pillar of the Fairchild Empire. Unlike her cousins Thomas and William, Margaret had inherited her property through her father rather than building it herself, and she managed it with a precision that surprised and sometimes unsettled the men who did business with her. She kept detailed account books, personally inspected every aspect of her operation, made decisions based on profit margins rather than tradition or sentiment. Her husband, Philippe Rousseau, had died in a riding accident in 1845, leaving Margaret a widow at 38 with no children. Rather than remarrying or selling the plantation, as many expected, she had taken full control of the operation and proceeded to run it more efficiently than Philippe ever had. She modernized equipment, negotiated better prices for her sugar, reduced waste to levels that made other planters quietly envious. This efficiency extended to how she treated the 130 enslaved people who worked her land. Margaret wasn't cruel in the way William Fairchild had been, not given to random violence or theatrical displays of power. Instead, she was coldly practical. She calculated the minimum food necessary to keep people working, the optimal balance between punishment and productivity, the precise value of every human being she owned, down to the dollar and cent. In some ways, this made her more dangerous than someone like William, whose cruelty was at least comprehensible as human weakness. Margaret's approach reduced people to numbers in her ledger, to assets that could be optimized like any other resource. She saw nothing wrong with this because she genuinely believed she was being rational, even humane, by avoiding unnecessary violence in favor of systematic efficiency. When Margaret invited Celia to prepare the parish council dinner in January of 1848, she specified exactly what she wanted, a meal impressive enough to demonstrate her hospitality and wealth, but not so extravagant as to seem wasteful. The parish council would be making decisions about road improvements and tax assessments. Margaret wanted to ensure they remembered her cooperation and generosity. Celia arrived at the Rousseau plantation on January 14th, traveling with Daniel in the same wagon that had carried her to William's estate months earlier. The journey took a full day, the roads made difficult by recent rains that had turned them into channels of thick mud. Margaret's kitchen was well equipped but strictly organized. Everything in its place, nothing wasted or excessive. Margaret's cook, an older woman named Hattie, who had worked on the estate for 40 years, showed Celia where ingredients were stored, which pots and pans to use, where the herbs and spices were kept. Hattie was friendly but cautious, aware that Margaret monitored the kitchen supplies carefully and would notice if anything was missing or misused. This presented Celia with a challenge she hadn't faced at Thomas or William's plantations. At the main Fairchild estate, she had access to Elizabeth's still room and could take what she needed without close oversight. At William's estate, the general disorganization had made it easy to work unnoticed, but Margaret's precision meant every item was accounted for, every ingredient tracked. Celia adapted by bringing her own supplies, telling Hattie that she preferred to use specific herbs and spices from the main Fairchild estate because she was familiar with their quality and freshness. This was plausible enough that Hattie accepted the explanation without question. Celia unpacked her basket in a corner of the kitchen, arranging small cloth bags and glass bottles on a shelf, all of them labeled with common ingredients: black pepper, cinnamon, dried thyme, vanilla extract. The labels were accurate as far as they went. What they didn't mention were the additional contents, the powders and tinctures Celia had carefully prepared and mixed into the labeled spices. She had learned over months of practice that disguising her additives within ordinary seasonings was safer than trying to add them separately to finished dishes. This way she could season food normally. Her movements would look routine. Anyone watching would see exactly what they expected to see. The parish council dinner was scheduled for January 18th. Margaret had invited 12 council members and their wives, a gathering of 24 people who represented the political and economic power structure of St. Martin Parish. These were the men who decided which roads would be maintained, which neighborhoods would receive improvements, which complaints would be heard and which ignored. They were also, without exception, plantation owners or merchants who profited from the plantation economy. Celia spent 3 days preparing for the dinner, working alongside Hattie to create a meal that would meet Margaret's exacting standards. The menu included oyster soup, roasted duck with orange glaze, rice with mushrooms, green beans and butter sauce, fresh bread, and 3 different pies for dessert. Each course required hours of preparation. The duck alone needed to be cleaned, seasoned, and roasted for precise amounts of time to achieve the proper texture and flavor. As she worked, Celia paid attention to the conversations happening around her. Margaret met with council members in her office during the days leading up to the dinner, discussing the agenda for the upcoming meeting. Celia, working in the kitchen adjacent to the office, could hear fragments of these conversations through the thin walls. She heard them discuss a petition from Free People of Color in Breaux Bridge requesting permission to establish a school. The council rejected it unanimously. One member commented that educated Negroes were a threat to social order. She heard them discuss a report of slave unrest on a neighboring plantation, agreeing to increase patrols, warning each other to watch for signs of discontent among their own workforce. She heard them discuss business casually, mentioning profits and losses, complaining about the cost of cotton, celebrating the high price of sugar. She heard them discuss human beings in the same tone they discussed livestock or equipment, as things that could be bought or sold or worked harder if properly motivated. And she thought about the dinner she was preparing, about how carefully she had measured the additives in her spice jars, about how she had calculated dosages based on the number of guests expected. She thought about how these 24 people were not just individuals, but representatives of a system, nodes in a network of power that extended far beyond St. Martin Parish. On the evening of January 18th, Celia and Hattie served the meal in Margaret's dining room, a space that could comfortably seat 30 people at a table made from Louisiana cypress. The council members and their wives arrived, dressed formally, the men in dark suits, the women in silk dresses that rustled when they moved. They greeted Margaret warmly, complimented the house, settled into their seats with the comfortable assurance of people accustomed to being served. Celia brought out course after course, each one prepared exactly as Margaret had specified. The oyster soup was rich and savory, the duck perfectly browned with crispy skin and tender meat, the rice fluffy and infused with the earthy flavor of wild mushrooms. The guests praised every dish, commented on Celia's skill, suggested that Margaret was fortunate to have access to Thomas Fairchild's cook. What they couldn't taste, what no one at that table could detect, was the additional ingredient Celia had incorporated into multiple dishes. She had used a different substance than in her previous work, something she had extracted from water hemlock roots gathered along the bayou. Water hemlock was among the most poisonous plants in North America, containing a toxin that affected the central nervous system rapidly and severely. But Celia hadn't used enough to cause immediate effects. Instead, she had calculated a dosage that would produce symptoms within 48 to 72 hours. Delayed enough that no one would connect the illness to the dinner, this selectivity was crucial to her plan. She hadn't poisoned the bread which Hattie had baked. She hadn't poisoned the pies which Margaret had ordered from a baker in Breaux Bridge. She had added her preparations only to the duck, the rice, and the green beans, dishes she had prepared personally from start to finish. The dinner lasted 3 hours. The guests lingered over coffee and brandy after the meal, discussing politics and business, while Celia and Hattie cleared plates and washed dishes in the kitchen. Margaret was pleased with how the evening had gone. Told Celia before she left that Thomas should be proud of his cook's abilities. Celia returned to the main Fairchild plantation the next day, her basket lighter than when she had arrived, her expression unchanged. She resumed her normal duties, preparing meals for Thomas and his 2 sons, managing the household kitchen, going about her work with the same quiet efficiency that had characterized her 16 years of service. 3 days later, the first reports began to arrive from Bro Bridge. John Devereux, one of the parish council members who had attended Margaret's dinner, had been found dead in his home on the morning of January 21st. His wife reported that he had been in good health at the dinner, but had begun experiencing violent tremors and convulsions the following evening. By the morning of the 21st, he was dead. Dr. LeBlanc was called to examine the body. Found symptoms consistent with severe nervous disorder, muscle rigidity, evidence of seizures, facial contortion suggesting extreme pain. The death certificate listed the cause as apoplexy, a sudden death that physicians attributed to various causes ranging from stroke to heart failure when they couldn't determine a specific diagnosis. By January 23rd, 2 more council members who had attended the dinner were experiencing similar symptoms. Alexander Thornton and his wife began suffering from tremors and confusion, along with a new symptom that hadn't appeared in the previous Fairchild deaths. Severe gastrointestinal distress. Dr. Cartwright was summoned from New Orleans, and he immediately recognized a pattern. When Cartwright arrived in St. Martin Parish on January 25th, 4 people who had attended Margaret Rousseau's dinner were dead. 7 more were experiencing symptoms ranging from mild tremors to full convulsions. This was no longer a mysterious fever that could be explained away as coincidence or hereditary weakness. This was an epidemic, or something that looked like an epidemic, concentrated entirely among people who had eaten a specific meal. Cartwright interviewed Margaret extensively, asked detailed questions about the dinner, the preparation, the sources of ingredients. Margaret provided her account books, showing exactly what had been purchased and from whom. Everything was in order, properly documented, nothing suspicious. Then Cartwright asked who had prepared the meal. Margaret told him. Primarily Celia, the cook from Thomas Fairchild's plantation, assisted by her own cook. Cartwright felt something cold settle in his stomach. He asked if Celia had prepared meals at any other locations recently. Margaret mentioned that Celia had also cooked at William Fairchild's estate in August, shortly before William fell ill. Cartwright returned to his notes from his previous visits to the Fairchild plantations. He reviewed the timeline of deaths. Elizabeth Fairchild in July, William Fairchild in November, now 4 parish council members in January. He noted that Celia had been present at the Fairchild estate throughout Elizabeth's illness, had prepared a meal at William's plantation before his symptoms began, had prepared the dinner that preceded the council members' deaths. The pattern was undeniable. But recognizing a pattern and proving deliberate poisoning were entirely different challenges, especially when the suspected poisoner was an enslaved woman whose very existence in the social order depended on her being seen as incapable of sophisticated planning or execution. Cartwright faced a dilemma. If he publicly accused Celia, he would need proof, not just circumstantial evidence based on her presence at multiple locations. Without proof, he would be starting a panic that could lead to violence against enslaved people throughout the parish. As white families became paranoid about their cooks and servants, the potential for bloodshed was significant. But if he remained silent and his suspicions were correct, more people would die. The parish council members were already dead or dying. If Celia continued her work, who would be next? Thomas Fairchild himself, his sons, the guests at his upcoming wedding? Cartwright made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He wrote a detailed report of his findings, including his suspicions about Celia, and submitted it to the Louisiana Territory Medical Board in New Orleans. He recommended that the board conduct a formal investigation into the deaths, including chemical analysis of any preserved food or medicines from the affected households. The medical board received Cartwright's report in early February of 1848 and immediately filed it away without action. The reasons for this inaction were never officially documented, but they weren't difficult to infer. An investigation into Celia would require acknowledging that an enslaved woman could carry out sophisticated murder across multiple locations over an extended period. It would require treating her as someone capable of complex reasoning, strategic planning, Sustained deception. Such an acknowledgement would undermine the fundamental premises of the slave system, which depended on portraying enslaved people as intellectually inferior, incapable of abstract thought, suitable only for manual labor under supervision. If Celia could systematically poison multiple households while avoiding detection for months, what did that say about the intelligence and capability of the hundreds of thousands of other enslaved people throughout the South? The implications were too dangerous to confront. So the medical board chose to attribute the deaths to a mysterious fever, possibly waterborne, possibly caused by contamination of a common food source, but definitely not the result of deliberate action by anyone, least of all an enslaved woman. This decision sealed the fates of everyone who would eat at Thomas Fairchild's wedding in April of 1848. Through February and March of 1848, the death toll from what was now being called the Tesh fever continued to rise. 7 of the 12 parish council members who had attended Margaret Rousseau's dinner eventually died. 5 others survived but suffered permanent neurological damage, tremors, memory loss, impaired speech. Their wives experienced similar but less severe symptoms, a pattern that puzzled physicians who expected disease to affect men and women equally. What the physicians didn't understand, because they lacked the framework to consider it, was that Celia had carefully controlled which dishes received her additions. The duck and rice had been served to everyone, but she had prepared the green beans in 2 batches, one with butter sauce for the men, one with olive oil for the women, as was common at formal dinners of the period. Only the butter sauce batch had contained her preparations. This selectivity served multiple purposes. It varied the symptom severity between groups, making the illness seem like a disease with different manifestations rather than deliberate poisoning. It also meant that some people survived to tell conflicting stories about their symptoms, further muddying the diagnostic picture for physicians trying to understand what was happening. Dr. Cartwright, increasingly frustrated by the medical board's refusal to investigate, began his own quiet inquiry. He couldn't accuse Celia publicly without proof and without institutional support. But he could gather information. He traveled to the 3 Fairchild estates, interviewed enslaved people about their daily routines, asked subtle questions about Celia's movements and activities. What he learned disturbed him profoundly. Celia moved between the estates frequently, was trusted with access to locked rooms and storage areas, had extensive knowledge of herbs and medicines that she had learned from her mother and other older enslaved people. She was respected among the enslaved community, but also somewhat isolated, keeping to herself more than most. Rarely engaging in the social interactions that provided relief from the brutality of plantation life, several people mentioned that Celia had changed after Anna's death the previous May, becoming quieter, more withdrawn. One woman, speaking carefully and only after Cartwright promised she wouldn't be identified, said that Celia had told her that God had stopped listening to prayers from enslaved people. So they would have to find other ways to change their circumstances. Cartwright recognized the statement as potentially significant, but also as hearsay that would never be admissible as evidence in any legal proceeding. More importantly, he was beginning to understand that proving Celia's guilt, even if he could do so conclusively, wouldn't solve the broader problem. The system that had created the circumstances leading to her actions would remain unchanged. The injustice would continue. This realization paralyzed Cartwright. He was a physician, trained to diagnose and treat. But the disease he was confronting was not medical, but social. Meanwhile, preparations for Thomas Fairchild's wedding proceeded. Despite the mysterious fever that had killed so many prominent citizens, Thomas saw no reason to postpone the ceremony. The deaths, tragic as they were, had occurred at Margaret's estate, not his. His household remained healthy. His son showed no symptoms. Life continued. Caroline Henricks, his bride-to-be, arrived from Natchez in mid-March with her personal belongings and 2 enslaved women who served as her maids. She was a practical woman, 35 years old, widowed 3 years earlier when her first husband died of cholera. She brought a modest dowry and valuable social connections throughout Mississippi and Louisiana. The marriage was financially advantageous for both parties. Personally suitable, though not romantic in any conventional sense, Caroline took immediate interest in the household management. Meeting with Celia to discuss the wedding feast and the ongoing needs of the estate, she was impressed by Celia's competence and organization. Commented to Thomas that he was fortunate to have such a capable cook. Thomas agreed. Noted that Celia had been with the family for 16 years and was entirely trustworthy. The wedding was scheduled for April 23rd, 1848. Invitations had been sent to 100 guests throughout Louisiana and Mississippi. The ceremony would take place in the plantation's garden, followed by a feast in the main house that would showcase the Fairchild family's continued prominence. Despite recent tragedies, Celia began preparing for the wedding in early April, working 12 to 14 hours daily to create the elaborate meal Caroline and Thomas had requested. The menu included crawfish bisque, roasted venison with cranberry compote, ham glazed with honey and cloves, 3 types of vegetables, fresh bread, and a towering wedding cake that would require 3 days to construct properly. As she worked, Celia thought about numbers. 100 guests, most of them plantation owners or merchants connected to the plantation economy, most of them people who participated in and profited from human bondage. She thought about how many enslaved people those 100 guests collectively owned, how many lives they controlled, how many families they had separated for profit. She thought about the dosages she would need, about how to distribute her preparations across multiple dishes to ensure maximum impact while avoiding immediate symptoms that would stop the feast and prevent full exposure. She thought about timing, about how long it would take for symptoms to develop, about whether she would still be alive when the truth finally became undeniable, because Celia knew with certainty that the wedding feast would be her final act. The scale of what she was planning couldn't be disguised as natural illness. When 100 people fell ill after eating a meal she had prepared, even the most willfully blind, observers would have to acknowledge what had happened. She would be arrested, interrogated, executed, probably tortured first to extract a confession that would satisfy the legal requirements. She accepted this outcome. She had accepted it months ago when she made her first addition to Elizabeth Fairchild's meal. Everything since then had been borrowed time, an extension of her life that she had used to inflict maximum damage on the system that had enslaved her. The only question that remained was whether she could complete her work before being stopped, whether she could serve that wedding feast and watch the Fairchilds and their guests consume what she had prepared. After that, her fate didn't matter, but fate in the form of Dr. Benjamin Cartwright intervened in an unexpected way. On April 10th, 13 days before the wedding, Cartwright arrived at the Fairchild plantation unannounced. He asked to speak with Thomas privately. The two men met in Thomas's study while Celia served them coffee. Cartwright waited until Celia left the room, then spoke bluntly. He told Thomas that he believed the mysterious fever was not a fever at all, but poisoning delivered deliberately through food. He explained his reasoning, the pattern of deaths, the common presence of Celia at each location where illness occurred. He showed Thomas his medical notes, the timeline he had constructed, the probability calculations that made coincidence implausible. Thomas Fairchild listened to this explanation with growing horror, not because he immediately believed it, but because he understood the implications if it were true. If Celia had poisoned his wife, his brother, the parish council members, then she had done so while living in his household, serving his family, preparing every meal they ate. The violation was not just criminal but intimate, a betrayal of the trust that the entire social system depended upon. But Thomas was also a practical man. He asked Cartwright the one question that mattered. Did he have proof? Cartwright admitted he did not in any legal sense. The evidence was circumstantial, based on patterns and probability rather than physical evidence or confession. Moreover, the medical board had refused to investigate. Local authorities were unlikely to act on accusation alone, especially given the social complications involved. Thomas considered this information carefully. He could dismiss Cartwright's warning, continue with the wedding as planned, hope the physician was wrong, or he could take precautions, even without proof, to protect his guests and his family. After a long silence, Thomas made a decision that likely saved dozens of lives. He told Cartwright he would postpone the wedding, citing concerns about the mysterious fever and the appropriateness of large gatherings during what appeared to be an epidemic. He would send Celia away from the estate, not as punishment, but as a precautionary measure, perhaps loaning her to Margaret Rousseau, whose household had been so devastated by illness that extra help was needed. Cartwright suggested a different approach. If Thomas wanted to know the truth, he said, there was a way to test it. Keep Celia at the estate, but restrict her access to food preparation. Have other cooks prepare the family meals for 2 weeks. If everyone remained healthy, that would suggest Celia was not responsible. If suspicions persisted, Thomas could take further action. Thomas agreed to this plan. That evening, he informed Celia that he was temporarily reassigning her duties. She would assist with other household tasks, but would not prepare meals for the family. He explained that he wanted to give her a rest before the wedding preparations resumed. A plausible explanation that Celia accepted without visible reaction. But inwardly, Celia understood exactly what was happening. Someone, probably the physician from New Orleans who had been asking questions, had connected her to the deaths. She had been discovered, or at least suspected. Her access to the one tool she had been using for 10 months had been cut off. She felt a curious mixture of disappointment and relief. Disappointment that she wouldn't complete what she had started. That the wedding feast wouldn't happen as planned. That the Fairchild dynasty would survive her efforts. But also relief that the constant vigilance required to maintain her deception was over. That she would no longer need to calculate dosages and watch for symptoms, and wonder if each meal would be her last before discovery. For 2 weeks, Celia performed other household duties while 2 cooks from a neighboring plantation prepared the Fairchild family meals. Thomas, his sons, and Caroline remained healthy. No tremors developed. No tongues darkened. The absence of symptoms was not proof of Celia's guilt, but it was certainly suggestive. And Thomas found himself watching Celia differently, seeing not the familiar cook who had served his family for 16 years, but a stranger whose thoughts and motivations he had never understood. Just when Thomas Fairchild thought he had avoided disaster, everything accelerated toward an ending that no one had predicted. On April 20th, 3 days before the postponed wedding was supposed to have occurred, Margaret Fairchild Rousseau died in her sleep at her plantation near Breaux Bridge. She was 41 years old and had shown no symptoms of illness before retiring to bed the previous evening. Her cook, Hattie, found her the next morning and immediately sent for Dr. LeBlanc. LeBlanc examined the body and found the now familiar signs: facial contortion suggesting pain, rigidity in the limbs, the faint sweet smell that seemed to accompany these mysterious deaths. He wrote another vague diagnosis on the death certificate: sudden apoplexy. But privately, he contacted Dr. Cartwright and told him that Margaret's death fit the pattern exactly. Cartwright traveled to the Rousseau plantation and conducted his own examination. Margaret had eaten dinner the previous evening with 2 neighbors who had come to discuss a business matter. Both neighbors were experiencing mild tremors and nausea, but nothing as severe as Margaret's fatal reaction. Cartwright questioned Hattie extensively about the meal preparation and learned something that made his blood run cold. Celia had visited the Rousseau plantation 3 days earlier, on April 17th. She had brought preserves and baked goods from the Fairchild estate as a gift for Hattie. A kind gesture that seemed entirely normal. Hattie had served some of these preserves at dinner on April 19th, the night before Margaret died. Cartwright immediately went to the Fairchild plantation and confronted Thomas with this information. He told Thomas that Celia had found a way to continue her work despite being removed from kitchen duties, that she was distributing poisoned food through gifts and visiting other locations. Thomas needed to act immediately, Cartwright insisted, before anyone else died. Thomas Fairchild called for his overseer and the parish constable. That afternoon, April 21st, 1848, Celia was arrested and confined to a locked storage building on the plantation while authorities decided how to proceed. She did not resist arrest. She did not protest her innocence. She simply allowed herself to be taken to confinement, her expression as neutral and unreadable as it had been throughout her years of service. The interrogation of Celia began on April 22nd in the locked building where she was being held. Present were Thomas Fairchild, Dr. Cartwright, the parish constable, and a magistrate from New Iberia named Judge Armand Thibodeau. Also present, taking notes, was a young lawyer named Charles Dupré, who would later become a district attorney and whose private papers would eventually reveal details of what happened in that room. Under Louisiana law in 1848, an enslaved person accused of a crime had no rights of due process, no right to representation, no protection against self-incrimination. The interrogation could proceed however the authorities chose. using whatever methods they deemed necessary to extract information. The purpose was not to determine guilt through a fair proceeding, but to extract a confession that would satisfy legal formalities before carrying out punishment. But something unexpected happened in that interrogation room. Celia, rather than denying the accusations or remaining silent or begging for mercy, did something that shocked everyone present, she confessed. Immediately and completely. Without any coercion whatsoever, she told them everything. She described how she had begun planning after Anna's death, how she had used Elizabeth Fairchild's still room to gather materials, how she had extracted poisons from cherry pits and oleander and water hemlock and other plants growing throughout the parish. She explained her methods of disguising the substances in food, of calculating dosages, of timing exposures to avoid immediate suspicion. She confirmed that she had poisoned Elizabeth Fairchild, William Fairchild, the parish council members at Margaret Rousseau's dinner, and finally Margaret herself. She estimated she had killed 23 people in total, though she acknowledged the exact number might be higher or lower, depending on whether some victims had survived longer than expected or whether some deaths attributed to natural causes had actually been her doing. Judge Thibodeau interrupted her confession multiple times, disturbed by its calm, methodical tone. He asked her if she understood what she was admitting to. If she comprehended the consequences, Celia replied that she understood perfectly. Had understood for months that eventual discovery and execution were inevitable outcomes of her actions. Thomas Fairchild, listening to this woman he had known for 16 years reveal herself as someone entirely different from what he had imagined, finally asked the question that had been haunting him: why? Celia's answer was simple and devastating. She said that she had murdered his family and their associates because they had murdered hers first. Slowly, over generations, through a system of ownership that destroyed families, denied humanity, and justified itself through convenient lies about natural hierarchy and necessary order. She said that Anna's death had clarified something she had been trying not to see for 30 years. That appeals to morality or mercy or law would never change anything, because the people in power had no incentive to change a system that benefited them, so she had decided to remove some of those people, to create consequences where none had existed before, to demonstrate that the power they held was not absolute. She said she had no illusions about changing the broader system through her actions. She knew 23 deaths would not end slavery, would not reform plantation society, would likely not even make most people question the fundamental premises of their world. But she had reduced the suffering in one small way by removing people who caused it. And she had proven to herself and to her daughter Mary that enslaved people were not the passive, simple creatures that planters needed to believe they were. This confession, delivered in clear, precise language that demonstrated intelligence and education that Celia was not supposed to possess, created an immediate crisis for everyone in that room. Judge Thibodeau understood that if Celia's words became public, if people learned that an enslaved woman had systematically murdered prominent white citizens over 10 months while living among them and serving them daily, the social panic would be extraordinary. Moreover, the confession revealed something that threatened the ideological foundations of the slave system. Celia was articulate, strategic, capable of long-term planning and sophisticated execution. She was, in other words, obviously and undeniably fully human, possessed of all the intellectual capabilities that the system insisted enslaved people lacked. Acknowledging this in any public way would be dangerous. It would give credibility to abolitionists who argued that enslaved people were just as capable as anyone else, and were being denied freedom not because of inherent limitations, but because of deliberate oppression. It would make other enslaved people dangerous in white imagination, transforming them from controllable laborers into potential threats who might be planning similar actions. Judge Thibodeau made a decision that prioritized social stability over justice or truth. He declared that Celia's confession would be sealed, that she would be executed quickly and quietly without a public trial, that the official explanation for the deaths would remain the mysterious fever that had been cited on death certificates. The medical board's investigation, such as it was, would be closed without findings. Dr. Cartwright protested this decision, argued that the truth should be documented even if it was not made public. That medical knowledge would benefit from understanding how the poisoning had been carried out. Thibodeau overruled him, stated that the risk of the information spreading outweighed any potential benefits. Charles Dupre, the young lawyer taking notes, later wrote in his private papers that he had never felt more disgusted by the legal system he had chosen to serve. He described watching Celia face her executioners with more dignity than they possessed, seeing her condemned not just for her crimes but for demonstrating capabilities she was not supposed to have, witnessing justice perverted to protect a social order that called itself civilized while operating through systematic brutality. Celia was hanged on April 25, 1848, in a private execution attended only by the necessary officials and a priest who offered last rites that she declined. Her last words, according to Dupre's notes, were directed at Thomas Fairchild. "You will remember me every time you eat." Her body was buried in an unmarked grave on the Fairchild plantation. Location unrecorded, her name absent from the death register. The official record stated simply that a female slave had died of fever, same as the others. If you've stayed with this story until now, if you've felt the weight of what Celia did and the impossible choices she faced, I need you to do something. Hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs to hear stories that challenge simple narratives about right and wrong. Leave a comment with your thoughts. Not whether you approve of what Celia did, but whether you understand why she did it, because that distinction matters. The Fairchild dynasty did not survive Celia's campaign. Thomas Fairchild postponed his wedding to Caroline Henricks indefinitely, then eventually canceled it entirely when Caroline decided to return to Natchez. The association with so many mysterious deaths had made the Fairchild name socially toxic, a liability rather than an asset in business dealings. Thomas sold the original plantation in 1849 to a consortium of investors from New Orleans who had no connection to the previous ownership. He moved to Texas with his two sons, started a small ranch, lived quietly until his death from pneumonia in 1859. His sons both died during the Civil War, fighting for the Confederacy, ending the Fairchild bloodline entirely. William Fairchild's plantation was sold at auction after his death, broken up into smaller parcels that were purchased by various buyers. Margaret Rousseau's estate suffered the same fate, divided and sold to settle debts and legal claims. By 1850, less than 3 years after Celia had begun her work, all 3 Fairchild properties had new owners. The family name had disappeared from St. Martin Parish records. Dr. Benjamin Cartwright continued practicing medicine in New Orleans, but never spoke publicly about the Fairchild case. His journal, containing his suspicions and observations, was donated to the Louisiana Territory Medical Board after his death in 1862. It remained in archives until destroyed by fire in 1923. The few fragments that survived were insufficient to reconstruct his full account. Charles Dupre, the lawyer who had witnessed Celia's interrogation, kept his private papers secret throughout his life. After his death in 1901, his daughter found them while settling his estate. She read his account of the case and was disturbed enough by what she learned that she donated the papers to a historical society in Baton Rouge with instructions that they not be opened until 1950. When researchers finally examined Dupre's papers in the 1950s, they found his detailed notes about Celia's confession, his description of the investigation and cover-up, his personal reflections on justice and complicity. His account was the only surviving documentation of what had actually happened in St. Martin Parish in 1847 and 1848. Modern historians have debated the case, some questioning whether Dupre's account might have been exaggerated or fabricated, others pointing out that the pattern of deaths he described matches records from the period, even though official explanations attributed them to disease. Chemical analysis of the deaths is impossible since no preserved tissue exists. But toxicologists have confirmed that Celia's described methods would have worked exactly as she claimed, producing the symptoms that physicians documented. The case has become a controversial episode in Louisiana history, studied by scholars of slavery, resistance, and social systems. Some view Celia as a murderer who killed innocent people. Others see her as someone pushed to extreme action by an evil system, someone who used the only tools available to her to fight back against people who were actively participating in her oppression. What is not debatable is that Celia existed, that she was enslaved on the Fairchild plantation, that she possessed intelligence and capability that the system was designed to deny. Whether she committed the murders she confessed to, whether her confession was coerced despite Dupre's claim that it was voluntary, Whether the authorities fabricated parts or all of her story to justify an execution they had already decided to carry out remains uncertain. What is certain is that 23 people died in St. Martin Parish between May of 1847 and April of 1848, that the deaths followed a pattern physicians could not explain, that the explanations offered at the time were deliberately vague to avoid uncomfortable questions about security, trust, and the capabilities of the people that society claimed to have under control. Mary, Celia's 8-year-old daughter, was sold to a plantation in Alabama shortly after her mother's execution. No record exists of what became of her after 1850, whether she was told how her mother died, whether she understood what Celia had done and why. These remain unknown. The sale separated her from everyone she knew, erasing her history as thoroughly as her mother's unmarked grave erased Celia's final resting place. The enslaved people who worked the Fairchild plantations were dispersed when the properties were sold, scattered throughout Louisiana and neighboring states, their community destroyed by the economic consequences of their owners' deaths. Whether any of them knew or suspected what Celia had done, whether they told stories about her among themselves, whether her actions became part of the hidden oral tradition that preserved truth when official history recorded lies, cannot be determined from surviving records. What can be said is that in the spring of 1848, for a brief period, the Louisiana plantation system experienced something it was not designed to experience: genuine fear of the people it claimed to control. Whether that fear changed anything in the long term is difficult to prove. But the Fairchild properties were never rebuilt to their former prominence. Several plantation families in St. Martin Parish sold their holdings and moved elsewhere in the years that followed, claiming the region had become unhealthy, possibly cursed, though they would not elaborate on what they meant by that. The story of Celia, the slave who whispered death, remains one of the darkest and most complex episodes in Louisiana history. It raises questions about resistance, justice, and moral responsibility that have no easy answers. Was Celia a hero or a murderer? Was she justified in her actions, or did she become the very thing she was fighting against? Did she reduce suffering or simply add to it? These are not questions with simple answers. They're not supposed to be. What we can say is that Celia was a human being, intelligent, capable, driven to desperate action by a system that denied her humanity at every turn. She was a mother who watched other mothers lose their children. A daughter who learned from her mother that knowledge was power, even when power was forbidden. A cook who understood that the boundary between nourishment and poison was sometimes just a matter of measurement. She was someone who decided that if she couldn't save everyone, she could at least make those responsible for the suffering pay a price. Whether that makes her right or wrong depends on where you stand, on what you believe about justice and revenge, about resistance and violence, about what people owe each other and what they're owed in return. History doesn't give us heroes and villains as cleanly as we'd like. It gives us human beings making impossible choices in impossible situations. It gives us Celia, standing on a platform with a rope around her neck, looking at the men who came to watch her die, and telling Thomas Fairchild that he would remember her every time he ate. And he did. According to Dupre's notes, Thomas Fairchild never enjoyed a meal again. He ate for sustenance, but took no pleasure in it. The taste of everything was ashes in his mouth. Some might call that justice. Others might call it trauma. Maybe it was both. What's undeniable is that Celia achieved something extraordinary. She took a system designed to make her powerless and found power within it. She took knowledge meant to serve her oppressors and used it against them. She survived, in an environment designed to break her, and when she finally broke, she broke outward instead of inward. She didn't change the world. Slavery continued for another 17 years after her death. The Civil War that eventually ended it had nothing to do with her actions. Her name was deliberately erased from official records. Her grave was left unmarked. Her daughter was sold away and forgotten. But for 10 months in 1847 and 1848, Celia demonstrated something that the architects of the slave system desperately needed people not to know: that the enslaved were just as intelligent, just as capable, just as strategic as anyone else. That the only thing keeping the system functioning was violence and the threat of violence. That, given opportunity and motivation, the people at the bottom of the hierarchy could reach up and tear down those at the top. This is why her confession was sealed. why the truth was buried, why authorities chose to attribute the deaths to mysterious fever rather than acknowledge what had actually happened. Because acknowledging Celia's intelligence and capability would have required acknowledging that slavery was not a natural order but a constructed system of oppression, that enslaved people were not content with their condition, but were actively seeking ways to resist, that every plantation kitchen, every household, every interaction between enslaved and enslaver carried the possibility of resistance. That fear, once planted, could not be uprooted. The story of Celia ended with her execution in April of 1848, but the questions she raised did not die with her. They echoed through the remaining years of slavery, through the Civil War, through Reconstruction and Jim Crow and the Civil Rights Movement. Through every conversation about justice and resistance and the price of freedom, they echo still. When we talk about resistance to oppression, we want clear heroes, people whose methods we can approve of without reservation, people who fought back without becoming fighters, who resisted without causing harm. But history doesn't always give us those heroes. Sometimes it gives us Celia, someone who did terrible things for understandable reasons, someone who killed innocent people who were not, perhaps, as innocent as they appeared. Someone who chose violence because non-violence had achieved nothing. You don't have to approve of what Celia did. You don't have to call her a hero. But you should understand why she did it. You should understand the system that created her. You should understand that between the ideal of peaceful resistance and the reality of generational trauma and daily brutality, there's a gap that easy moral judgments cannot bridge. The story of the slave who whispered death is not a comfortable story. It's not meant to be. It's meant to make you think about power and powerlessness, about justice and revenge, about what people do when every other option has been taken away. It's meant to remind you that history is written by the winners, and the real stories are often buried in unmarked graves. Celia's grave has never been found. Her daughter's fate remains unknown. The full truth of what happened in St. Martin Parish died with everyone who witnessed it. But the questions remain. What would you do if you were Celia? If you had watched Anna die of grief? If you knew your own daughter faced the same fate? If you had the knowledge and the opportunity to fight back, even knowing it would end in your death, would you choose peace and accept suffering? Or would you choose resistance and accept the consequences? There's no right answer to that question. There's only the answer each person gives when faced with impossible choices. Celia gave her answer in cherry pits and oleander flowers, in carefully measured doses distributed over months, in a dynasty erased and a system momentarily shaken. History judged her harshly, or tried to, by erasing her from the record, by refusing to acknowledge her existence, by attributing her actions to fever and coincidence. But she existed, she acted, she mattered, and somewhere in Louisiana soil, in an unmarked grave on land that was once the Fairchild plantation, her bones rest with that knowledge. She was Celia. She was enslaved for 31 years. She was a mother, a daughter, a cook, and a killer. She was intelligent and patient and capable of extraordinary planning and execution. She was human. Fully, completely, undeniably human. In all the complicated, contradictory ways that humans can be. And for 10 months in 1847 and 1848, she made the powerful fear the powerless. She made those who claimed absolute control realize that control was an illusion. She demonstrated that the system they built on violence could be answered with violence. Whether that makes her a hero or a villain is not for me to decide. It's not for anyone to decide, really. It's for each person who hears her story to wrestle with, to think about, to use as a lens for examining their own beliefs about justice and resistance and what we owe each other in a world that often seems designed to pit us against each other. The story of Celia is the story of resistance. Not the kind we celebrate in monuments and textbooks, the messy kind, the kind that asks hard questions and doesn't provide easy answers. The kind that forces us to confront the difference between what we wish people would do and what people actually do when pushed beyond endurance. Remember her name. Celia, the slave who whispered death, the woman who brought a dynasty to its knees, the mother who fought back with the only weapons available to her. Remember that official history tried to erase her and failed. That the truth, buried though it was, eventually surfaced. That stories of resistance survive even when those who resist do not. And remember that every meal you eat, every day you live in relative freedom, exists on a foundation built by people like Celia. People who made impossible choices in impossible situations. People who resisted in whatever ways they could. People whose names were deliberately forgotten but whose actions shaped the world we inherited. You will remember me every time you eat. Celia's last words to Thomas Fairchild. A curse. A promise. A truth, he remembered. And now you will too. What do you think of this story? Do you believe Celia was justified in her actions, or do you see her differently? Was she defending herself and her community using the only method available? Or did she become something else entirely? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I want to hear how this story sits with you. Whether it challenges your assumptions, whether it makes you uncomfortable, because the best stories should. If you found this investigation compelling and want more stories from America's hidden history, the ones that were buried because they revealed too much truth, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Share this video with someone who appreciates complex historical narratives, someone who can handle stories without easy answers. Until next time, remember that history is rarely as simple as we're taught. The truth is often buried in unmarked graves. And the stories that matter most are the ones someone tried to silence. The slave who whispered death. 23 lives ended. A dynasty erased. A woman remembered. This is history. Raw, complicated, and real.